Well, good morning or good evening or wherever you may be today and welcome here to the event on deal making in 2021. We've got a great panel here. I was just telling everybody on the panel that we've got about 2,500 people registered for the event today, which I think underscores just how much interest there is in deal making in the industry right now and the kind of trends that we're looking for in 2021. Want to introduce everybody on the panel today. We have Glenn Hunsinger, who's the Pharma and Life Sciences leader at PwC. Elizabeth Miley, the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Bristol Myers Squibb. Debbie Barron, the new Senior Vice President, Worldwide Business Development Chief for Pfizer. James Sabry, the longtime Global Head of Pharma Partnering at Roche. And Marianne DeBacher, who runs strategy and business development at Bayer. I want to set the stage here. I want to turn to Glenn here initially to set the stage for what we're looking at in 2021. We just come off of an extraordinary year. The numbers are unprecedented, Glenn, and it has to have a big impact on business development. So tell us a little bit about where we are right now.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thanks for allowing PwC to sponsor this event with such talented corporate development and business development leads with Elizabeth, Debbie, James, and Marianne here. Listen, I'm filled with optimism for 2021. I know in this current world, that for people outside the industry, I think most people in the industry may agree they're very passionate about it. But outside, between the pandemic, the economy, the politics, and just the world right now, there's certainly a lot of negative things or things that would add pressure. But I think everyone's pretty optimistic about what 2021 holds. I think the industry is poised for growth, platforms, profiles, strategies. Has never been greater focus. Corporate culture in our industry is different and dynamic. And most importantly, innovation is here. When we think about the last couple of years around oncology, cell and gene therapy, it's super exciting to see that progress at an exponential rate. If you think about this year, getting a vaccine in months versus years, unprecedented. Yesterday announcing Alzheimer's, whether or not, it's still early days, but it's still exciting to hear somebody still focused and really trying to crack that code. And then you think about, areas that are large, but we didn't talk about innovation in cardiovascular. And now we're talking about innovation. So I think it's just super exciting time for the industry. Businesses, have reset to sort of look to sort of that next chapter. It's always good to take a step back and say, well, how did we get here? We got here through a lot of hard work. At least everybody on this panel I know has gone through a lot. A couple of years ago you had, and I'll generalize, a lot of CEO, a lot of exec changes. I think everyone looked for the next sort of chapter. Strategies got reevaluated, portfolios. Again, the same way, looked to change. And there's a lot of activity to divest, spin, partner, and acquire. And while at the same time in that sort of biotech world, we had a lot of funding from the VC and the biotech, and the innovation continued to move along. So we're sort of at this point where everyone's sort of reshaped their company and ready for growth. I know the numbers sometimes don't tell it justice. We get a lot of media and news where we talk about, hey, M&A was down 40% in 2020. We would all agree, everyone on this panel right now, we didn't work 40% less. If anything, you worked 2x, 3x. What you did in the past. But 2019 was sort of a big year. BMS, Celgene, AbbVie, Allergan, and so a lot of integration of that. You got to capture value. A lot of activity with Pfizer. Deb's lived through it with JVs around OTC and around established products, and Merck spinning off Organon. So just a lot of operational activities to really get companies fit for purpose and look to sort of the next wave of progress in our industry. There's no doubt there's some headwinds. I think, as I listen to all the JPM sessions, I think every CEO did a great job addressing it head on. Pricing is here to stay. And I think the industry is really poised to be able to address it head on. I'm optimistic that there'll be a solution for both parties with win-win, where the industry and everyone else, the industry wants to get their sort of breakthrough therapies to all patients, not just the ones that can pay for it. So I feel like, and I'm optimistic that there's an answer and solution there, but there's no doubt that's kind of a cloud that sort of every investor continues to hang over and look at. So to recap where I think we are as a company, have never been in better shape. Great leaders, great teams. innovation has never been more sizable. Cash is available on balance sheet, cash flows and ability to borrow. And then you sort of have this, the biotech world, which continues to get funding and has great innovation. Now, all that said, that's great sort of tailwinds, but I don't envy what our panelists here have to deal with, which is you have to go execute on transactions that create shareholder value. They're highly scrutinized, every deal you do. Every investor wants to poke holes on it. So our panelists, I'm excited to be here, hear what they have to say. I know they have a very difficult job. So I appreciate you guys making the time here because it's not easy to create shareholder value.
One of the figures that I heard about 2020 as opposed to the rest of the past decade was that there was a total of $134 billion raised through venture capital, through IPOs, through follow-ons, you name it. $134 billion flowing into the biotech industry versus the previous high of $69 billion. You see about $500 billion overall flowing into the industry over the past 10 years. The level of activity has just been extraordinary. I think that as far as the biotech industry is concerned, it's a seller's market. But I want to turn to the panel here and get everybody else's impression in terms of what's different about 2021, or what's the most important similarities about 2021 with last year, but also how do you think things are going to play out this year? So Marianne, let's get started with you in terms of, what's different this year. Is it a seller's market? How does that affect your business? How does it affect your strategy?
Sure, yes, thank you, John. So undoubtedly, right, last year, I remember last year in the beginning at JPM, we were talking about what the market was going to look like, and that maybe we were going to go from a bull to a bear market, and maybe that it was going to shift from a seller's market to a buyer's market, and everything would be very good for big pharma. Obviously, it turned out to be a totally different 2020, as we just said, and you had that incredible dichotomy. On the one hand, pandemic happening and all the impact that had on people, but then on the other hand, our industry and innovation being stronger than ever before. And to the point that you were making, the amount of capital available for innovation was just, record high, right? I mean, it was record high from a funding perspective. It was record high from an equity investment VC into companies' perspective. And there were, of course, a large number of IPOs. I think there were more than 75 last year. So from a deal-making perspective, what we saw last year, and, as Bayer, we have been incredibly active. I mean, we entered into 25 strategic partnerships last year. We acquired 2 companies, everything pretty much virtual. But what we realized is that the competition was really fiercer than ever. So it was not just that we were competing with other big pharma companies, we were competing with an incredible amount of capital available in the market. And to give you one example, when we had sort of put together our strategy to become a leader in cell and gene therapy, and we had identified AskBio as a target that we wanted to go after, AskBio was in the process of, going IPO. And so next to being in competition with a number of big pharma companies, we were also in competition with an IPO process. And I really, see that kind of dynamic is going to continue this year. Again, there's a tremendous amount of funds that have been raised that still have to be deployed into innovation. There has been a lot of VC money going into startups, so there is no shortage immediately to progress a lot of science. And there's a healthy IPO market. We are now also competing with SPACs that make it easier for companies to access public capital. So I think as big pharma, we will continue to need to elevate our game, right, and really bring something very substantial and do things differently. And that's really what we try to do, for example, in our acquisition of AskBio, where we acquired a company, but we leave them at arm's length and we give them a lot of independence to progress their science. And we try to create an ecosystem within our company that is going to attract talent and that is going to be conducive, right, for entrepreneurs to work with us and to
Let's open it up to the panel here. Are attitudes changing from among the biotech companies that you all talk with as a result of the money coming into the industry? Are you seeing a different sort of a negotiating approach? Have things fundamentally changed? James?
Yeah, let me actually extend what Marianne just said. I think we're moving into a truly fenestrated model for business development between pharma and biotech. And what this means, John, is that now is the windows open up between these two large parts of our industry, and capital and products can flow more freely between them. You're starting to see the kinds of things that Marianne just described, where it's not just let's acquire AskBio and bring them into Bayer, it's let's leave them alone. You know, something that Roche did with Genentech, we've done it with Spark, but I think you're going to see much more of this, where there truly is movement of products, talent flow, research collaborations across the industry. I mean, one thing I think we all can agree on is that startup biotech companies are a fantastic corporate venue for innovation. We've seen this with COVID vaccines. It wasn't the big pharma companies that built those COVID vaccines on the whole, it was a couple of startups. And I think we all, I'd be interested in the other panelists as well, but we all realize this. And so the more we can move from big pharma is the recipient of things that come from biotech companies to a model where there truly is a flow back and forth between open windows of capital, products, talent, and research collaborations, I think it will be better for patients in the long run.
I want to really emphasize what James just said, because the capital really does help to enable innovation that we're seeing. And I fully agree that the combination of the innovation coming from companies and some of the expertise and capabilities that the larger companies have really has an amazingly great way of coming together. And part of our role, I think, is looking for the different ways to bring that together in a way that is optimal for timing and eventually for getting the right medicines to patients. And certainly, it could be an example of many things, but obviously our collaboration with BioNTech, I think, has been a really good example of that, where there was tremendous work and technology that they brought. We entered into a relationship with them, really to work on it, not in what we knew was going to be such an accelerated fashion, but to be able to broaden that and bring together what they were developing with the capabilities in research and clinical development and manufacturing that we had, and on the commercial side has really been a collective gathering of skills and capabilities. And I think it's the kind of thing we all want to be, have been, but want to continue to really be looking for and leveraging in the relationships that we have. And I think the capital, kind of going back to that theme, really helps that, because it helps to create, the give people the ability to develop that innovation that we're talking about.
So Elizabeth, it was interesting watching you take your position at Bristol Myers, because you stepped in there where Paul Biondi had been working for a number of years. You really hit the ground running. And I'll say this, I think you surprised a lot of people in the industry, because you had just done the Celgene deal. And most big companies, when they acquire a company that size, spend a significant amount of time adapting and bringing in this new pipeline and meshing these things together, usually with a tremendous amount of destruction and waste. But in any case, I think that what people were really interested by was the fact that the company was continued to do a lot of different deals. I mean, we continued to bring in new technology, continued to do that. And that was a different sort of an experience than a lot of people had expected. I know a lot of people really breathed an enormous sigh of relief. So from your own perspective here, I mean, when you do that sort of a transition for a large company and you move into this position as well, I mean, did you find it particularly challenging, or is it particularly, is the environment right now facilitating the sort of strategy and approach that you guys have?
So, perhaps because I wasn't at BMS as we were actually going through the acquisition and the initial integration of Celgene, and I got there just after. I have the benefit of it. It was just, this was normal, right? And there was nothing normal about it. I started March 30th, so I started in the pandemic, so I've yet to ever be in my office. And so there's been nothing normal. Maybe 27 years in investment banking made that all okay, because usual doesn't stick around very often. But I think that a couple of things for us. I think the first and foremost, I do think that a lot of work and thought had gone into the ultimate integration of and bringing together of Celgene and BMS and the charting of a new path. And so while the close had only happened in late November of 19, there was a lot that had been done and a lot of progress until we went into lockdown. And in some respects, lockdown has helped us really accelerate the integration of the companies. And I think that's, there are many, many, many bad things, mostly bad things about COVID, but there are many really good things. And some of the collaboration and innovation that has taken place across the industry, I think, is absolutely something to really be applauded. And I think it's innovation and collaboration that's happened both for COVID, for vaccines, for treatments, and for other initiatives on a public health perspective. But for us, because we had advanced our integration well, because things were going well, we were also able to keep all of that work ongoing and be very much forward focused into what else we needed to do. There were very important parts of our business that had not really benefited, if you will, from the pipeline that was coming in from Celgene, where we knew we had ongoing imperatives, and we were able, because of how well the integration had gone, to really look very clearly for areas of innovation, which included things like our Dragonfly partnership and partnership on the neuroscience front, included the in-license of the Dragonfly IL-12, and obviously included myocardia. It's something where I think we just remain very, very focused on the fact that all of our businesses have got portfolio needs. And going back to your question of really sort of what's different, what's new, we all need growth, and we all need innovation if we're going to have growth. And so we're going to keep looking for it. And I think that's probably something that will remain the same. And it was certainly an imperative that we felt quite strongly.
So I want to get into the COVID-19 thing here in a second. And before I get into the next phase of the conversation, I just wanted to tell the audience that there is a facility to ask a question of the panel here as we have this conversation. We'll spend the last 10 minutes or so on questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, go ahead and ask it. We'll be screening those questions and going over those. If you want to direct it at a particular person, let us know by naming that person where you'd like to have that question directed. So COVID-19 has been a big issue. I think it almost seems to me in looking back that there was this initial hesitation and then almost this furious switch to a new platform, a new approach toward, being able to move to Zoom, being able to do this. A number of large companies got together for JPM, used the same platform to set up business development conversations with companies. I think that had been a major concern. How is this going to continue to play out? Now that we're in the second phase of the pandemic, almost as if there was some sort of a handbook, it seems, in terms of how this whole thing came together. But it was all done on the fly, wasn't it, James? I mean, you had to come up with it and adapt, and almost overnight.
Yeah, I mean, very much almost overnight. And I think many of us looked at that pandemic and made a couple of major decisions. Firstly, to dedicate parts of our BD group specifically to COVID. And we looked at hundreds of opportunities very rapidly before deciding to sign the deals with Atea for a small molecule polymerase inhibitor and with Regeneron for their neutralizing antibody cocktail. So that was one thing that immediately happened. The second thing, of course, as you mentioned, John, was the infrastructure switch and moving quickly to Zoom or G-Meeting, whatever it was. And what we found pretty quickly, especially for those companies where we had relationships, was that things sped up. Because no one wants to negotiate for 2 weeks on a Zoom call. I mean, it was uncomfortable. So what used to take 2 weeks would now take 4 days. And we started to find very quickly in April and May that deals were happening faster. And as a result, we did over 90 deals last year at Roche. And that's a large number more than we normally do. I think part of that is the efficiency of working along these platforms. Now, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with companies you don't know and have never, ever met personally, because many of those companies we had a relationship with. So I think that this year we'll see how well it continues into 2021, because many of us are now looking at companies for whom we're meeting some of these startups for the first time. And whether we'll be able to be as effective with them as we were with companies in 2020 is still to be seen.
So let's open that up. I mean, everybody, obviously Pfizer had kind of a quick fling in relationship with BioNTech in terms of getting into the whole new, radically new kind of vaccine technology, messenger RNA. Was it going to work? Was it not going to work? And so on. But it has deal making, the velocity of deal making, has that accelerated? And do you expect it to continue to accelerate into 2021? Anybody want to pick that up?
Well, the one thing I would pick up, I think just building a bit on what James has said, is that, and I fully agree, I think all of the partnerships that, and the deals that we signed were also companies that were known to us. You know, I do think that it'll be a test if we can really build new relationships as effectively, although I think we're on the path there, because I think collectively as an industry, we didn't really have the option to sit there and dither. I think that every one of our organizations is incredibly purpose driven and very focused on delivering innovation for our patients, as well as, frankly, delivering ongoing product for our patients that they're relying on daily. So we really didn't have a choice. But what I do think is going to continue to support the velocity factor or some of the efficiency learnings. I would anticipate that going forward, and when we can travel again as much as we might want to, certainly this is the longest time I've not been on a plane over to Europe since I was a teenager. You know, we will do those trips, but we will probably do less of them. We will do many more things using the efficiency. I've heard from a lot of companies and a lot of bankers, the efficiency of the IPO process, because of the ability to do everything over Zoom meetings. I don't know that people will ever go back to really wanting to schlep and crisscross the country and over to Europe over 7 to 10 days in a roadshow. I just don't see that ever coming back. And so there are going to be elements where we have to, where we just have to adapt. At the same time, there's still just a lot of fundamental work that goes into all of the decisions. I think as you're hearing from other members of the panel of the large number of deals that have been done, those are largely relationships that were there. They've been companies and science that have been followed for a long time. We do have to find ways to do that. And that is going to be challenging, I think, the longer that we are in this virtual world.
Yeah, maybe I can comment a little bit on that. So I joined Bayer about 16 months ago. And so I was largely, still in the build of the strategy mode for the first 6 months or so. And by the time we were ready with our strategy, COVID had hit. And so we were actually in a position where we really had not, often not the relationships built with the companies and the targets that we were going after, for example, in the cell and gene therapy space. So we really had to start from scratch on a number of the partnerships we've done. And we talked about it before, John. I really thought it was impossible to build, the trust, the level of trust that you need to build to acquire a company, to enter into a major strategic partnership. I didn't think it was possible to do that just by, Zoom or virtually. But it is possible. And it's actually, as was said, I think the velocity is higher, the efficiency is higher, and you can really do this. But it also requires a tremendous, investment still of your time. I mean, from, the AskBio acquisition, from non-binding offer to signing was less than 6 weeks, but that meant, daily interactions of many hours, on virtual platforms, right? So it is certainly possible, but I think what we are going to see is that we're going to miss the serendipity, right? If we know what we're going after, we can make it happen. But it's these, things that happen when you sit somewhere at a conference and you coincidentally meet someone and you can connect the dots. I think that is something that we're really going to start missing. And again, there's some conferences that are starting to put, virtual chats and lunches and whatever in place to replace that. But I think that is something that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to do.
I think that the audience would really like some feedback from everybody on the panel about where the deals are going to happen in 2021. Obviously, traditionally, when you want to find value in the biotech industry, you go earlier, you go preclinical, you go towards the discovery side of things. That once you move up towards in mid stage and you've got clinical data, and then late stage, the dollars and everything else do tend to multiply. And we've seen some really extraordinary deals on that side, right through to M&A as well. So I'm kind of curious in terms of where everyone sees the dial moving in 2021. Are we going to be moving more towards the early stage stuff? Is there, there has been traditionally, particularly among the big pharma companies, a focus in on where their late stage pipeline is. That's a big deal with the investors, obviously. So Glenn, maybe you could start off with this. I mean, where do you see any kind of a movement in the dial towards one side or the other of preclinical through to M&A and commercial and all that?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I think the beginning part of what I'll say will align with what everyone's doing. The $5 to $15 billion deal to fill a pipeline from 2023 to 2027. I think everyone's focused on that. I think the good thing is most of the portfolios today have good growth in there. There's some opportunities to continue to sort of fill and grow on the platforms and the portfolios they have. So I think that's going to continue to be a flurry of activity there. I think the difference now, and in this, I know not everybody believes what I'll say in this. I think we'll see a continued, $30 to $40 billion Alexion type deal of somebody who really wants to get into a different therapeutic category, wants to make a splash. Yes, the prices are rich, but have an opportunity to really sort of double down and get in an area to position themselves for that sort of next wave. And then, I think there's a chance there's kind of one or two sort of bigger ones that may happen. I think that's probably the more provocative thought that most people would probably say no, but I think there's a chance that you could see something bigger. So I think this year for 21, we're kind of expecting across the spectrum. And the difference really in that medium category, that $30 to $40 billion, which we really haven't seen until late in 2020.
So Debbie, one of the presentations today was with Albert Bourla and talking about 2023 to 2025 being kind of the area that the company's focused on in terms of new drug development and new drug approvals and so on. How does that influence your own business strategy for 2021?
Well, we're continuing to look for opportunities that are really going to, help support, the growth of the company going forward. And truthfully, that's really, continuing, to build the exciting pipeline that we have. And so, for us, I think it really, and I think probably for many of my fellow panel members here, it comes back to really, where is the innovation and where are the real breakthroughs that, as we say, are going to change patients' lives. And that's really, I think, the crux of what we are looking for. What's going to really make a scientific difference, and certainly, timing is important to us, and the development timeline is important to us. But the focus really for us is where are those scientific breakthroughs that, again, we believe have a real opportunity to make a large difference. And that's true across each of our businesses. I think, as Elizabeth said before, we're all looking for growth, and that's true across the portfolio of what we have. And again, probably true for all of us. So whether it's in our rare disease business and with a particular focus in gene therapy, but in other areas as well, in our oncology business and our vaccines business, where we're obviously doing a lot, but continuing to do more there, in our inflammation and immunology business, in our hospital business, in all of these areas, in our internal medicine business, there's innovation in cardiovascular areas, as Glenn alluded to before. So there's innovation happening across the board in our collective areas of interest, and really what's going to drive it for us is, as I said, where really are the breakthroughs from a scientific perspective that we believe at the end of the day are where we can add our own capabilities and our own expertise to be able to really make a difference for patients.
Okay, so James, it's been interesting watching you over the last couple of years since you took over both the GRED and PRED and merged both of the deal-making groups into one global group. Because it doesn't seem like you're really focused in on any particular area in terms of the pipeline, early, middle, or late, rather than all of them. And looking at where you might be able to do different things along the lineup. One of the things that stood out for me was the recent signing of your third drugging RNA deal, where you seem to have really identified this is an area that you really wanted to get into on an early basis. So what are the kind of technologies that you're focusing in on the early basis where you can see that there's going to be a big potential in the future. And how do you know about that? How do we find out more about what these strategies, these early strategies are?
Well, and we were talking about a little bit about this in the panel before the webinar started, but I think you're going to start to see these windows truly open up, John. So there's real collaboration between the biotech company and the pharma company. We've done this with RNAs. You mentioned with our deal with Ribometrics recently, but a deal with Arrakis earlier on, not to mention a foundational deal we did with PTC that allowed us to now launch Evrysdi, which is an RNA binding molecule. So we believe at Roche that our scientists working openly with the scientists at the biotech company generate the best outcome for patients, rather than one where the biotech company does their thing and simply throws a product over the wall to us. Again, this is what I mean by this truly open fenestrated model. And I think we're going to see this across the board in pharma. Not, Roche, this has been something we've been moving more towards over time, but I think you're going to see it across the board. The other thing I'd like to point out with COVID, and this may speak to this question as well, is that there's some unsung heroes in our industry now that are coming forward, diagnostics and manufacturing, for instance. And these are two areas that before kind of were sideshows to the drug discovery and development issue, which got main billing on the marquee. But being able to manufacture effectively, we've seen this all over. And I know that, Debbie, this is something that you guys are dealing with heavily with your BioNTech collaboration. And diagnostics. It turns out that a healthcare sector without the ability to diagnose effectively, and that's not simply the disease, but as we're now finding out with COVID, the molecular pattern of the disease. What variant do you have? So it's not just simply do you have the disease, but what is the molecular biology of disease-causing agent that you have? I think we're going to see this across the board. And this will require just much more collaborative work between pharma and biotech, rather than simply acquisition and in licensing. And I think that underlies some of the RNA drugging deals that you've seen with us, John.
Okay, so there are a lot of things that biotech can be good at, and there are some things that biotech is not good at. Manufacturing, I think, would qualify as an area that biotech is not good at. I've seen just example after example of a company where they go in, they get a CRL because they didn't have their manufacturing worked out, because the contract manufacturer they're working with is having problems. It causes a lot of different issues. And I wonder about how you all work through these areas where you don't want to focus in on the strengths, but you also want to focus in on the weaknesses and where the weaknesses are likely to appear, and how you can facilitate on that, presumably, where manufacturing on your part would presumably be one of the strengths. So how do you factor that out? I'm curious, Marianne, I mean, is there a frank conversation here about, hey, this is where you're good and this is where we think we can really help?
Yeah, and I know it's a little bit of an unsatisfactory answer, John, but it really depends, right? There is no cookie cutter approach to any partnership. And sometimes, we actually as big pharma have less expertise than the partner. And that is certainly the case sometimes in, again, the cell therapy space, the gene therapy space. So I think for every partnership, what we really try to do is having an honest conversation around what is best for the product, right? And where are the strengths of each of the parties, or multiple parties, and how are we going to bring that together to be successful? To give you an example, I mean, we just entered into a partnership with Atara for allogeneic CAR T. I mean, they have, they have a lot of expertise in that field. Same for AskBio. They have, excellent expertise, and they have a CDMO business for AAV-based gene therapies. The same with BlueRock, an iPSC-based cell therapy company we acquired, which has a lot of expertise that Bayer did not have before that acquisition. So we really try to, in any case, make sure that we look at what is it that the company brings, what is it that we have, and how can we, build on the strengths. The last deal that we announced with CureVac was a different situation, where it is a little bit like you were pointing out, where CureVac was ready with their COVID-19 vaccine to really scale, and it did not have the capacity to do so, right, as a biotech company. And so that's where we then step in and obviously can use our capabilities and scape to help things progress in a much faster and more efficient way. But it really depends, on the type of partnerships that you're looking at.
Perhaps one piece of advice for biotech companies is to become strong in the area like manufacturing, and then you get a better deal when it comes to an M&A kind of a situation where you don't, where you bring more to the table and you get paid for that as well. So Debbie, I am kind of curious, when you talk, if after having as many conversations as you've had with different biotech companies, what are the key pieces of advice that you give to the industry as a whole as it relates to how they can advantage themselves in a negotiation with a larger company?
I think one of the first points that I would start with is actually building on something Marianne just said, which is I think one of the most important things in engaging in a conversation is an open conversation, really ensuring that each other, and I was going to say we, but actually it's true for both companies, that both companies really understand what each is trying to get out, what the other is trying to get out of the particular, whether you call it deal, the arrangement, the collaboration. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And then what is it that we do both bring to the table? And what is it that we might need each other for? I think being really open about that, and again, I could say initially, but even along the process of the discussion, the more clear that is, the more clear and logical it is as to how both companies can come to an agreement as to not only operationally what it is we might do together and how to leverage the expertise, but where the value of that relationship really comes from. And I think that also builds the stronger relationship and builds the basis for, working through, whatever the economics may be. But I think that's probably the most important point that I could make, which is, the openness of what everyone brings and how to understand the other party, I think is really important. I would also add that there's, we are trying to be as flexible and creative as we can. And I think, again, many in the industry have been thinking this way as well, as to how to creatively think about different, different ways of working together. And so, you may have seen, for example, a few months ago, we announced an initiative to actually make some equity investments in companies where we could also collaborate a bit with sharing some of our expertise and ability to really, provide some earlier input before maybe a potential broader arrangement happens, or just to help position the company in a way that helps them again benefit from the resources that we have. And so we're using that as an example to really try to be creative in working with companies in different ways. And so I go back to my original point, which is I think the more companies can be open about what it is they need, what it is they want and are looking for, and can be open to listening to where we're coming from as well, I think then together that sets the basis for being able to work through the deal making.
Okay, so Elizabeth, you want to say something?
Sorry, John, I was just going to add on to that. I fully agree with Debbie, and I think that maybe putting just a slightly finer point on it, I do think that there are times, and this is sadly one of the things that has really developed quite strongly last year, and maybe it'll change in 21. I think there are a lot of pressures and advice being given to biotech companies by their investors, by their potential IPO bankers, et cetera, about structuring of partnerships and what rights they should retain versus not in order to be viewed as valuable. And that's just the wrong way to start the conversation. Certainly it's an important aspect. And I think we all know that their investors have a key role in partnerships in the same way that ours do. But if you really are starting from what it is you're each looking to get out of a partnership and what you each bring to the table, and then you allow it to be structured in a sensible way, it's just a better conversation. So that would be something that I would just say, people really should be taking to heart everything Debbie was mentioning in terms of what is it that you actually should be structuring. I mean, we've had companies with zero commercial infrastructure and barely entering phase 1, and they're determined to have a global COCO. It's just a conversation that's really hard for people to even wrap their heads around. So that is something I think is quite important.
Well, let's talk about this, because obviously I think one of the outcomes of having so much money flowing into the industry is because these companies have positioned themselves as the next Regeneron. So you've got the investors coming in, and they're coming in because they think they're backing the next Regeneron. So that's going to influence the way they structure a deal, right? Because they're going to have to look like the next Regeneron, however that comes about. And that has to create some complications because, as you said, Elizabeth, this is not necessarily their deals, their area of strength. So James, when you get into a situation like that, do you just walk away, or what do you do with it?
Well, it depends how egregious it is. I mean, to follow up on what Elizabeth said. I mean, there are times when it's egregious enough that you do walk away. But let's be clear here. Success in the biotech sector, if you want to be the next Genentech or the next Regeneron, your products have to make it to market. There's no way of making that happen if your products don't work. And I think what Elizabeth was really getting at was that some of these deal structures, they may erode the ability of the product to be properly developed, or for it to be properly commercialized with the access and all the issues that we as big companies have to deal with on the commercial side. I mean, this is, I think, a really clear message that I would give to the biotech companies, that you've got to put the patient first in how you deal with us. Because if you do that, it maximizes the chance that your product will make it to market. And once it makes it to market, it will have access to all those patients that need it. And that is the view of success. That will allow them to be the next Regeneron or the next Genentech or the next whatever. Anything less than that is robbing the patients and the industry of the benefit of the combined intellect of the companies. And I have this discussion fairly often with biotech companies about really getting back to basics of what we're trying to do.
Yes, I think that is truly important. And then also, I mean, we can really help those companies, right? I mean, it is not that we have to do everything ourselves and that is a fixed, negotiation standpoint. I think you have to, again, go in, see what is best for the asset, see what is best for the company. And if the biotech is really committed to becoming a commercial entity, then I think we also have to be flexible to find ways to help them be successful in doing that, right? So again, I think as big pharma companies, we have to, much more than in the past, show much more flexibility in making those things possible.
Well, I would also add, for the investors who want their new babies to be the next Regeneron, they might want to look back to the founding date of Regeneron and the 30+ years of persistent fighting and work and effort and blood, sweat, and tears and dollars that went into getting to the point of commercial product and ultimately profitability. These companies have, I mean, that, as one of the original innovators in the industry, it's we should give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a biotech executive earlier in the week where he was talking about repeating the kind of success rate they've had in R&D at Alnylam. And it's interesting because Alnylam went through 15 years of blood, sweat, and tears before they made RNAi happen. And it's still not easy. I mean, they're not an overnight success or anything like that. I do think that Moderna has kind of created this has helped to accelerate this sense that you can become the next Regeneron. And some of the circumstances around that are extraordinary, obviously. But the figure that sticks out to me from 2020 is that out of 54 companies that had a new drug approval last year, 24 of them got their first drug approved last year. So it is happening. I mean, it's definitely a reality. They are getting what they wanted. They're taking their drugs all the way through to an approval, frequently following a path of going after a rare disease, smaller trials, an accelerated review process at the agency, and then onto the process of getting it into the market. And frequently they run into an awful lot of problems because commercialization is seemingly, to me in any case, a whole other world. So Glenn, when you're talking to somebody from your perspective at PwC, I mean, what are the areas of advice that you give to a company that has, a lot of commercialization expectations?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, not only am I optimistic, but I'm biased. I'm probably biased towards my colleagues here in Big Pharma. I think, they've done a tremendous job really going deep on the science, being flexible, and frankly, sometimes, turning into a pretzel. The amount of conversations we've had where people, want the science to continue. They don't want to get in the way of it. They want to retain the right people, but they want to acquire it, right? And then you're not in the integration land. You have to take control. So from my view, I feel like the Big Pharma has done a tremendous job really being equals to biotech, to figuring out solutions, being constructive and being open. So that's, to me, if you're the recipient of that, I just continue to encourage them to say, listen, there are different paths, right? The capital markets are still robust, and that's a path, but there are other collaborations and partnership opportunities that are actually much better and give you better upside, still give you freedom and autonomy, and still give you what you want, which is to continue to develop groundbreaking science for patients, right? Without the nonsense of worrying about sort of funding. So I'm still optimistic, but of course I'm biased towards my colleagues because I think they've done a tremendous job really trying to make things work.
Okay, well, I want to turn a little bit early to some questions from the audience, because we have a number of questions to go through here. Usually the audience has better questions than I do, so I'd like to pick some of these up. Some of this we've addressed, and some of it we haven't. How do you see the dynamic between early mid-stage deals, pre-proof of clinical concept, and contingency-based payouts? Will biopharma gravitate to early stage deals that offer more upside or innovation potential, but temper that with CVRs, options to acquire, and other contingency milestones? Are there new transaction structures or nuanced deal terms that are becoming more useful? Anybody want the more useful nuanced deal terms here? Anything that
So probably as the newest member on this side of the table, I'll take a first pass. I mean, I think, again, back to what Marianne said before, it really all depends. I do think that contingent-based milestones have been a foundational part of how business development deals have been structured, right? In terms of true in-licensing and gaining access to innovation, especially in the early stage. And I think that will, there continue to be new ways to come about that and to get to yes between what the two parties are looking for. I do think that one of the things that we have seen as an increase is also companies that were on the cusp of going public, but then at the last minute have pulled back and have been willing to sell, but where you can put in contingent or earn-out type payments, including, I think, Marianne, if we read the press releases, that was something that you all did with AskBio, and that's been done in a number of situations, and I think it can provide shareholders with a floor of value and help them retain upside. In the public setting, I think, as we all know, those are just harder deals to do. They can happen, but there's usually some pretty specific circumstance. But it's, I tend to view in the public world as a banker, a longtime banker, I view contingent payments more as value bridges when you can't quite get there, as opposed to something that anybody really wants to have. But in the private world and in the partnering world, I actually think it will continue to be, and I think we'll continue to see a lot of innovation in what people are doing.
And I see it a little bit differently. I mean, we have done structured deals both in the case of Candy and AskBio. Post-acquisition, if you want to leave the companies with a lot of independence, I mean, having these CVRs really creates an alignment of incentives, because you really tie up money to the things that are going to create value, right? So I think it also helps you to get, again, if you want to leave a company alone and give them a lot of independence in driving their science, but still making sure that the incentives of value creation down the road are going to be aligned. And for example, we have, created CVRs around technological advancement, clinical asset advancement, manufacturing milestones. So I think it's really a helpful tool.
Yeah, I would just add that it all comes back to.
Let's get Debbie first and then James.
I was just going to say that it all comes back to, in some ways, that same transparent conversation we were happening before, and how both companies see the risk and see the value and where those inflection points are. And I think, again, I speak for probably all of us, but certainly from a Pfizer perspective, we're very interested in being as flexible as makes sense to be in our deal structuring in almost any way. And it will be driven by the way we see value and risk and what that opportunity is. And both companies will come to understand that better the more open that conversation is. It's not to say that, two companies will always see that in the exact same way, but that's where some of these, different approaches to deal structuring can help bridge that.
Yeah, and I was just going to basically echo what Debbie just said. If that first conversation about capabilities and what you're bringing to the table is really an open and honest one, and by the way, that's happening most of the time now, then the rest of how the deal is designed can flow from that. And what we have found is that companies where that discussion happens openly and quickly are the ones that we get to deals with more effectively. And by the way, those deals are likely to be more effective, because what we haven't talked about here is getting the deal done is just the beginning. That's the wedding. It's the marriage that is the tough part. And the alliance management piece of this, where you're managing an ongoing alliance where the outcomes, all the possible outcomes, have not been anticipated in a contract, that's also an extremely important part about the dynamic aspect of deals. And the better that initial conversation, as Debbie pointed out, is, the better the alliance management piece can also flow from that.
Interesting. Okay, another question here gets into a favorite topic of mine. Do you see the potential for significant deal activity in 2021 between biopharma and tech companies that are developing next-gen AI, quantum computing, and digital technologies? Which tech companies in those spaces do you think will be aggressively pursuing those kinds of deals? Maybe the first part more than the second part, in terms of, you know, what your appetite is here for AI. It's everybody's topic, and everybody's getting into it in one fashion or another. So from your perspective, how do you pursue it? James,
Well, maybe
James has got a.
Yeah, let me start with that, John. And we this is something that Roche has been interested in and Genentech for a long time, but it has really hit a feverish pitch with the hiring of Aviv Regev as our head of R&D at Genentech, and she's a computational biologist, so it comes from a slightly different background than the standard R&D head that you're used to in the industry. We believe that machine learning plays a very important role, not only later on in drug development and eventually commercialization, but also early on in drug discovery and development. But the real potential of that is still years off. And what we're starting to do is build some of those foundational deals and capabilities, again, using this fenestrated model that we talked about, in order to bring that in. I think it's going to be a while before we get really good at this, but I have no doubt eventually we will get good at this. It's like the early days of Google Maps, where it was okay, but if you knew a city, you could actually probably beat Google Maps in your commute. Eventually that stopped, and Google Maps was always better than the learned commuter. And I think the same thing is going to happen in drug discovery over time.
Yeah, and it's probably the same for everyone here, but I mean, there are so many of those opportunities now, John, that I mean, I certainly had to set up a separate team to deal with all the opportunities and to look into them. And we look at it in two different ways. One is the digital transformation of, you know, drug discovery and drug development, and then just how are we going to, you know, use AI and machine learning to be more effective in drug discovery. And we did that with recursion, for example. And then also, how are we going to be more effective in drug design? And we did that with Schrödinger, for example, and Exscientia. And then on the other side, you know, how are we going to use digital to deliver a different type of care? And that's a totally different animal, right? And that's why we, you know, we ended into one deal with IDS OneDrop. But so in that entire space, the number of opportunities that are coming to us, it's really quite remarkable. And we need to hire, you know, as James is saying, real experts from the tech industry to help us evaluate those.
I would just emphasize, especially in the pandemic environment we're living in, where so much is virtual, it is, you know, AI is a really important component, as has just been talked about. But I think that last piece that Marianne touched on, there are so many elements of where technology obviously is, you know, supporting what we all do and what we all need to do to be able to get to prescribers and customers and patients in a way that is going to be most helpful to get medicines to them. So it's both the research and the development aspect, but it is very much on the other side of things as well.
I'm going to be having a conversation here in just a few minutes with a couple of your colleagues, Rupert Vesey as well as Aviv Regev, coming up on the Cancer R&D panel that we've got just right after this one. And it does bring to mind the fact that everyone here is working with colleagues, key colleagues that are driving a lot of these discussions, right? So I am kind of curious, you know, in terms of, you know, who are the key players in research and development that you all work with? Elizabeth, obviously you and Rupert work very closely on a lot of different things. I think that the audience would like to know where a lot of these conversations, where the discussions come from, where the targets come from, where the opportunities are as it relates to the colleagues that you work with.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that, John. So you're right. I mean, I view Rupert Vesey as my first and foremost partner in crime, because he's really the person that what we're doing when we're looking at new technologies, new innovation, that is whether it's going to be enabling early discovery or it's going to be in products that are getting ready to enter into the clinic. The vision behind all of that and the prioritization behind that all comes from Rupert and his team. And so his therapeutic and thematic research leaders, they really work to create a coherent strategy in terms of what they think the priorities should be given our portfolio and given our focus areas, and also where they think that the cutting edge innovation is occurring and where we should be placing some future bets. And to Debbie's point, you know, they've been very, very important to us, formulating strategies of where we'll invest behind companies that we think are incredibly promising. We may not yet be able to identify a specific business development relationship with them, but we think that they've got really promising science and technology. We want to be good supporters of them, both with capital as well as with expertise, and then follow them and hopefully find ways that we can specifically partner. And that really comes from, you know, the philosophies and the mindset from Rupert and his team. And then, you know, we're out there from the business development side, supporting that and through the evaluation and all of the other work that happens. And, you know, as you could probably tell if you went through the, you know, even going back to the AI discussion, if you went back and you looked at who the partners are for many of the companies that Marianne mentioned, I think many of us, if not all of us, have actually got partnerships with one or several of them. So, but you know, there are different perspectives. You know, we're each in slightly different areas of emphasis, right? We've got lots of areas of overlap, but our vision really starts with Rupert and the science and innovation.
So Debbie, Base Rothenberg just recently left as Chief Medical Officer at Pfizer, had played a big role there as well. I'm curious, I'm not actually that familiar with right now, like who's driving a lot of the conversations within the R&D organization at Pfizer?
Sure. So, so while I could comment on our senior executives, certainly, so our new Chief Medical Officer and Michael Dolson, who runs our R&D group, Rod McKenzie, who runs our development, our late stage development, they're all certainly very much driving the science. But what I would really comment on is in each of the business areas that I mentioned before, in each of these areas, we really have a group of three core people who are really driving the strategies in each of those areas. And so there's a chief scientific officer, a chief development officer, and a general manager who's driving all the commercial activity. And the three of them, we call them triads affectionately. And in some cases, you know, there may be an extra for a tetrad, but in each of them, they are really for their area of business, really setting the strategy and are really the experts. And certainly that is, you know, obviously influenced by the folks that I mentioned before, but it's really very much a dialogue where we have experts in the areas that we're in, where we like to think of them as they are really leading the sort of mini company within the company. And then they have a dialogue with the broader management team.
Great. Marianne, how about you?
Yeah, actually very similar to what Debbie was saying. So we have, you know, typically R&D, commercial and business development coming together to set out a strategy for any given area we want to venture into. For example, I mean, when we decided that we wanted to really go into cell and gene therapy, it was really a cross-functional effort of, you know, sort of boiling the ocean and trying to see where is it that we want to play. And of course, building on some of the knowledge that we already have through the, you know, the CEO of Blue Rock and so on. But it's not like, you know, one person that is having this overarching vision. It's in each of the areas, you know, bringing teams of experts together and then setting out a strategy and going after it.
Great. James?
Yeah, so John, I think you're aware of this. At Genentech, when I started there 10 years ago, we changed the way in which business development related to R&D and actually embedded ourselves within the R&D organization. So we have people from my team sitting on Aviv's leadership team, on William Powell's leadership team. And when we do a deal, the committee and governance that looks at it, and this is true in Basel and in San Francisco, is exactly the same committee that governs internal projects. And so we like to think of trying to eliminate any difference between the way we think about an external opportunity, although it is economically encumbered, obviously, from an internal opportunity in order to allow the science itself to be the key element that we talk about. And this idea of embedding business development within the R&D organization rather than having it sitting outside of it has served Roche and Genentech, I think, particularly well in making sure that the science is the main thing that we talk about.
Glenn, we're going to have to wrap up here in just a second, but I'm kind of curious from your perspective, how important is it to get to the right person in any organization before you have these conversations, particularly if you're on the selling side of the table?
No, listen, relationships are important and matter. I think we spoke a little bit about the fact that everybody has sort of leveraged some of the equity they've developed over the years. And I think, you know, while the video conferences and digital enablement will be here to stay and continue that, I think once we can all get back to some face-to-face meetings, that certainly will be a great path forward here. So we're excited for 21 for that to happen.
Well, that's great. On that note, we're going to wrap it up. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I love it. Business development is obviously the very lifeblood of the industry. And I think that that's definitely going to continue in 2021 and for a long time thereafter. Thanks for everyone for participating. Thank you to the audience. I really appreciate you taking some time with us. We've got another panel coming up in about 5 minutes on cancer R&D. Until then, until later, thanks very much, everybody. Cheers.
Okay, thank
Thanks
you.
all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.